Hello and good evening. My name is Frances Lomas Feldman, and I would like to thank you for selecting me to interview this evening to learn about the history of social work and how I have contributed to the profession. I look forward to talking with you about my life and my accomplishments and how I've contributed to the profession of social work. I would like to start by going over some general biographical information about myself to give you a little bit of a background of who I am before I entered into the field of social work. I was born on December 3rd, 1912 in Philadelphia. I was the youngest of 6 children. My parents' names were Harry and Dora Hoffman Lomas. My parents were Jewish immigrants from the Ukraine. My father, a master tailor, eventually moved my family to Los Angeles. I attended the University of Southern California, where in 1935 I earned my Bachelor of Arts degree. From there, in 1935 also, I married my husband Albert George Fieldman. We enjoyed 40 years of marriage together before he unfortunately passed away in 1975. While attending the University of Southern California, I ran a laundry service to help pay my tuition. During our marriage, we had one child, a daughter, named Donna Feldman, later Donna Feldman Monker. I initially entered the field of social work unintentionally or accidentally. When I first began at the University of Southern California, I began there as a freshman in 1931, and I was actually a pre-medical student, and I was waiting to move on to med school, and I obtained a social work job over the summer. From there, I never left the field. From there, rather than moving on to medical school, I actually continued in the field of social work at the University of Southern California, where I earned my MSW in 1940. 13 years later, in 1953, I earned my postmaster's certification from the University of Chicago. Just as I accidentally entered into the field of social work, I actually dragged my husband Albert into the field with me. Albert, who was originally a research chemist, was so captivated by hearing the stories from me about my experiences in social work that he followed me into the field, and he later became the deputy director of the USC, University of Southern California, Andrus Genealogy Center. When I began going over my studies and my accomplishments and my contributions to the field of social work, you may wonder when I had spare time to do anything else. However, when I did, my hobbies included travel, music, and writing. As we start discussing my career and my accomplishments, hearing that a couple of my hobbies include writing and travel won't come as a surprise to you. I authored 10 books in addition to contributing to numerous research projects, and I also traveled to over 200 countries. For my 95th birthday, I went and renewed my driver's license, where I received the perfect score, I might add, and this was 9 months before I passed away following suffering a stroke in September of 2008. I lived a full life during which I made enormous and incredible contributions to the field of social work and the profession. Following my passing, many described me as elegant, well put together, and intellectually engaged. Some others also may have described me as stubborn, as I defied many stereotypes of aging and lived independently until my death at the age of 95. I will now move on to discussing my career in the field of social work. Following graduating from USC in 1935, I had 20 years of experience from 1935 to 1954 working in several different variety of jobs in the field of social work before landing back at USC actually as a faculty member in the School of Social Work. Before returning to USC in 1954 as a faculty member where I remained for 36 years, I had employment in the field of social work in a number of different public and private agencies. I served in roles ranging from a caseworker, an administrator, a consultant, and a social work researcher. I then moved on to the most significant portion of my career, which was at the University of Southern California as a faculty member in the School of Social Work, where I remained for 36 years. And during that time, I remained very active in my career. Just as I entered into the field of social work unintentionally, I also entered into my major job or career unintentionally. I was a full time administrator for the Los Angeles County in public welfare while teaching part time. I came to USC as faculty with plans for it to be temporary, only so that another faculty member who needed to take a leave of absence could do that. And I never left. During my tenure at USC, I did some teaching in Africa and Ethiopia, similar to other faculty members of the School of Social Work at USC. My husband Albert and I went to Iran on 3 separate occasions to work with faculty at a school of social work there, which was developed by the first Iranian student who had attended USC as a social work student. I was particularly involved in the USC community. I was the first president of the Faculty Senate, and being a woman in this position was something a bit unusual. I developed relationships with the predominantly male faculty, which I was the president of during my 2 year tenure in this position, by including them in making decisions and allowing them to have a voice. I believe this is part of the reason why I was elected into the position of the president of the Faculty Senate. Social policy, in particular, was one of my strong areas of interest. The Board of Trustees had decided that faculty needed more benefits, and so $10 a month was contributed by the university to each faculty's health insurance. Now, keep in mind, this was in the late 1960s, so $10 a month back then was pretty substantial. And so I chaired a committee who was put together to determine what good use we could put the $10 a month towards each faculty member's health insurance to. President Hubbard of USC wanted an advisory council to include different members within the university, including students, to be put together. My thought was that perhaps he was suspicious of me, although I never directly came out and said this. The reason that I thought this was because, as the president of the Faculty Senate, I had asked for a minimum salary for faculty. In addition, I began a procedure for filing grievances, something that had never been done before. So for these reasons, I didn't think that he was too happy with me, when suddenly I was appointed the chair of the President's Advisory Council. Perhaps he thought that since I was so direct, I might as well be direct with him and working with him. So I served in this capacity for a couple of years, and during this time I was able to develop the Staff Association. During the Civil Rights Movement, there was a great deal of protest on university campuses and a great deal of concern between universities and the surrounding communities. These kinds of issues were involved during that time. And with all of that activity, there were the Watts riots. However, none of the university was damaged. There wasn't a brick touched or a window broken during these riots at USC. Our staff within the School of Social Work at USC was able to go down to the Watts riots, and rather than risk of harm, people made sure that our staff were safe and that they weren't harmed. President Topping, who was the president at USC at the time, attributed the lack of violence towards staff as being attributed to the guard presence during that time. However, I believe that it was how we treated others that kept the peace. I believe that even in the midst of the Watts riots on USC's campus and how the faculty were not harmed or even seemingly at risk of harm, had a huge impact on what we were able to do later on in the community. And for this, I have a deep appreciation. I was then asked by the university to be an academic consultant to the Macomb Commission to examine what happened during the riots. However, the university didn't use the report that I wrote, in my belief, because some of the members didn't like what I had to say. I examined such social issues as how long it would take a woman to walk to work in Beverly Hills, in addition to the complication of not having childcare. Additionally, I looked at issues such as when a woman with no transportation had to take one of her children to the hospital because that child was sick and thus had to drag all of her other children along with her. In my report, I offered solutions which went along with the problems, which was nowhere. We at the university did have experience with the Watts riots, however, and these were related to a lot of issues around civil rights. Dr. Topping, the president of USC at the time, was very valued as a mediator in getting things settled. He made it clear that we wanted people of all kinds at the university. This was true even more so in the School of Social Work at USC. At other schools of social work, students were striking due to the lack of minority, and this did not happen at USC. And I think this really promotes our value and my personal value of diversity within the School of Social Work and the profession. Part of the function of the advisory council that I had been appointed to by the president of the university was an activity to reach out to the community and to build and to mend bridges, making connections in the community. We wanted to promote to the community that we were an open campus and that there were opportunities here for all kinds of people with various different backgrounds and that we wanted them here at USC. Of course, however, efforts were not always successful. There were always those who were suspicious of motives. A lot of effort went into trying to make people comfortable with what the university was doing and what it hoped to accomplish. In 1982, at the age of 70, I retired from the University of Southern California. However, I did not spend my time idly, as I stayed very involved with USC. In addition, I also remained actively involved in research and writing. Now that I've discussed my career, I would like to move on to discuss some of the more large contributions I made to the field of social work in addition to the work that I did during my career, although some of these are connected with one another. In my legacy, I was known as many things, but most significantly, I would say that I was known as an educator and a consultant in the field of social work. One of the biggest contributions I made to the field of social work, and the one that I am probably most well known for, would be my groundbreaking study that I did in the 1970s that showed that cancer patients face discrimination in the workplace. In 1976, I began a multi-year study to investigate the work experiences of people treated for cancer. My research provided the first systematic evidence that employers and coworkers imposed harsh, even illegal, conditions on cancer survivors. And let me just say, to me, the results of this study were truly disheartening. My study looked at more than 200 Southern California cancer survivors and found that more than 50% of white-collar workers and more than 84% of blue-collar workers faced discrimination when they returned to work. Some of this discrimination was described as demotions, denial of promotions, and withdrawal of insurance coverage. The American Cancer Society, who funded this research, also used my findings to call attention to this problem. It was referred to as an early look at a continuing problem. The impact of this research was huge. This led to several states modifying fair employment legislation because of the study. As you all are well aware by now, or you should be if you've been listening to my interview, I joined USC and was very involved in the School of Social Work at the University of Southern California beginning in 1954. I played a large role in establishing the first curriculum in the West devoted to industrial social work. This involves helping people cope in the workplace. Also at the University of Southern California, I was a key founder of the California Social Welfare Archives, which is a volunteer organization which involves preservation of the state of social work history. I was reported to have almost single-handedly been responsible for the discovery and preservation of social welfare history in Southern California. One of the 10 books that I wrote was Human Services in the City of Angels, which was a 3-part series. But in this series, I shared my research that showed that Los Angeles was a pioneer in social services. To explain further, there was the act of reimbursing citizens for caring for sick strangers in 1950, 1850, and establishing city-run daycares in 1918. Now, going back a little further in time into the 1960s, officials in Alaska asked me to research social service needs of the natives and for me to report my observations, which led to many improvements in basic services. Also, while in Alaska, I rode on dog sleds and slept in igloos as I traveled to isolated Eskimo villages. I think that reflecting back upon many of these experiences I had, that I was described by many as a natural optimist, and I would say that this was one of my values as being strengths-based. I also just wanted to know how the rest of the world lived and worked, and this led me to traveling to over 200 countries. However, not by dog sled, that was just in Alaska. Now referring back to my time at USC, I innovated a number of programs and organizations which still exist. Some within the university, such as the Delinquency Control Initiative. I was on a small committee which began that also started agencies of several kinds due to lack of resources when World War II ended. There was a great influx of GI people, and this then caused them to accelerate some of their programs and more research. At USC, the president of the university that I started under when working there was Emergy Bogardus, and he he encouraged social work as a subspecialty. He was very interested in ethnicity, and I worked very closely with him. I knew him as a part of his graduate fellowship. He worked in a fellowship house, and so then when he came back to USC from Chicago in 1912, the year I was born, by the way, he brought the tradition of service to persons of various origins. Mr. Bogardus became the president and saw the need for social workers with training. The school started as a division of social work, focused on technique, theory, and knowledge of helping people. And it did give me a good feeling that the school has now been identified as one of the top 10 schools of the country, when in its early years it was seen as very conservative, one that seemed to serve an elite part of the community. When asked if I found conflicts between social work and the university as a whole, I think that the most difficult was just the budget allocation being small. I feel like everyone knew that people were in the field of social work for gratification, not money. When I began at UFC under the leadership of President Bogardus and later after him President Arlene Johnson, there is a philosophy at the school that I very much so agree with in my value system, which is that the best teachers of social work had to be close to the field of practice. And so this means that they had to be researching, consulting, etc., and spend time actively in the field in order to teach what we were actually learning and seeing in the field. For this reason, I tend to encourage many to volunteer in agencies. I feel like I also had very strong values in social rights, specifically with regard to public assistance. Public welfare was a great interest of mine. I was able to develop training for social workers in the field. And as long as we had them, qualified social workers, we didn't have the kind of problems that sometimes might exist even still today. Agencies not being staffed for the problems that exist, and then those problems falling by the wayside, which then leads to negative reactions toward the agency and toward the profession. During my time at USC, there was a great deal of social policy development affecting social welfare and improving children's services, in addition to mental health services, which were considered very important and still are. We at USC worked closely with the local hospital and health department. We cared about what was happening in the public sector. There was an influx of people of various backgrounds. The Committee on Fair Employment Practices came up during my administration, and many of the things developed during my tenure as Senate President have remained in place and have only continued to be built upon and grow. It was said by many following my passing that I essentially shaped society's understanding of social welfare history in California and defined the new field of social welfare in the West. Additionally, I spent over 50 years concentrating on the study of the social and psychological meaning of work and life. My studies of workplace behavior influenced employee assistance programs and state laws on employer discrimination. In addition, I helped form the first social work concentration in industrial social work in the West, and the Consumer Credit Counselors, which was a national network of 350 counseling services. And in summarizing my contribution to social work, I would like to review some of the awards I've received, some of the recognition I've received, and wrap up with books that I've written. I received several awards: the California Koshland Award, the USC Associates Dart Award for Distinguished Teaching, and the Los Angeles Award for Community Service, to name a few. I was named as the USC Distinguished Professor Emerita. I was the founder and president of the California Social Welfare Archives at the United Service Organizations. I received the Los Amigos Award for Outstanding Community Service. I was a member of the National Association of Social Workers, as well as the Phi Kappa Phi sorority. And as previously mentioned, I wrote 10 books. My master's thesis for my Master's of Social Work degree in 1940 at USC was titled Some Methods of Staff Development of the Professional Personnel in Public Welfare Agencies. And basically through this, I looked at and discussed the success with which public welfare agencies can serve the community and how that depends heavily on the quality of the personnel that it employs, and the need for a sound professional development program overall, that in order for an agency to carry out its duties and provide the best service to its client population, it must employ the most capable persons possible. The Family in a Money World is one of my books that I wrote in 1957. And to summarize this book, basically it looks at research from combining the aspects on culture and family life determined by money. And it looks at how a social work practitioner could provide assistance to individuals and families struggling to effectively manage and control this part of their life because it affects them so strongly. Family Social Welfare, Helping Troubled Families is another book of mine that I wrote in 1968. And to summarize this book, it basically looks at understanding the family, the individual, and the intra-family behavior, and the relationship of such behavior to coping with the continuing and changing circumstances of today's society. Basically, not all families can cope equally or adequately with the stresses with which they need to cope. The information in this book was directed primarily to social workers. However, it is the hope that the information provided in it can be helped with any helping profession, teachers, nurses, doctors, law enforcement, attorneys even. And finally, I saved this one for last since it seems to be connected to what I am most apparently known for, my research on cancer patients and discrimination in the workplace. This book here, Women in Cancer, I wrote a chapter in titled Female Cancer Patients and Caregivers Experiences in the Workplace. I would like to read to you from my abstract on this study, which reads, working women who have cancer history or who have some responsibility for the care of relatives with cancer often face a cluster of attitudes and behaviors in their employers and coworkers to which individuals touched by other kinds of illness are not exposed. Patients and caregivers may find that others in the work environment are compassionate and helpful in many ways, but may also encounter considerable hostility and fear expressed verbally or as shunning or other attitudinal problems in the work site. They may also be targets of overt or covert discrimination. These problems are explored using data from 3 recent studies on workplace experiences of white-collar and blue-collar workers who had recovered from cancer and of former pediatric cancer patients. So to summarize how I outlined the research in this chapter, basically I first looked at a woman's working role and how this defines her in society, defining her as things like independent, responsible, and, as I quoted, a mistress of her own destiny. The working woman will internalize the societal attitude correlating work with adequacy, with independence, and worthiness. Work affects who she sees herself through the eyes of society. And then looking at cancer, which is a certainly overwhelming battle. It's life-threatening and it involves inevitable pain and sometimes imminent death. This, challenging enough, to be followed by involuntary job loss or deterioration of working conditions under which working can harm a woman's mental and physical well-being. Women who are already forced to succumb to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness about having no control over the cancer and the effect it has on the quality of her life, if she survives. Also to consider, there are caregivers to these women who tend to often be other women, mothers, daughters. Some of the common pressures that were shared were conflict between the time and energy demands on the job and at home, fears and anxieties about the patient and the needed absences associated with caring for them, and if this would lead to job loss, and difficulties within the family due to the way it's expected that a family unit values and deals with each other, and then specifically on the ill parent or child with pediatric cancer, and how this could lead to neglect of other expected duties, neglecting other children due to the overwhelming preoccupation with the caregiving role. And so in my conclusions, I had interviews with working women and survivors or caregivers, and they showed the impact of attitudes on women who are concurrently experiencing cancer as either a patient or a caregiver and working. And from these, it was evident the quality of work and personal lives were affected negatively. Work ethic is important in society, even more so to recovered cancer patients, an increasing population. I wanted to look at how we can change the societal idea that cancer is shameful, contagious, and leprous. The first way is legislation to protect the workable cancer patients from actions and attitudes which negatively affect work status and opportunities, which would oppose workplace discrimination affecting those with cancer history. Employee assistance programs, providing a personal form of support system in addition to industrial social work services. And to wrap up, I would like to read you an excerpt from my chapter. This comes from a cancer survivor's recent letter. Where do I and other folks with cancer histories go for the courage to keep living? The diagnosis was frightening. Then my job as a dietitian was no longer there because my breast had been removed. My husband had trouble hiding feelings of revulsion. When the third place turned me down, I began running around and screaming, "What am I going to do? Where shall I go?" I calmed down and returned to the marketplace to shop again for a job. A job is more than my profession. It is a connection with life. Where shall I go? Where indeed.